Good afternoon and welcome to our Grow Native webinar, Dicamba and 2,4-D, Old Herbicides Causing New Problems with Robbie Doerhoff. My name is Haley Howard and I'm the Outreach and Education Coordinator for the Missouri Prairie Foundation. I want to thank you all for joining us for this webinar today, and I want to thank our Grow Native sponsors on the screen. During the presentation, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A section on your screen, and at the end, I will read those out to Robbie. This webinar is being recorded, and the link will be shared with all of you tomorrow, along with resources mentioned during the presentation and Q&A session. And now for some background on Robbie. Robbie Doerhoff is the Forest Entomologist for the Missouri Department of Conservation. She received both her bachelor's and master's degrees in biology from Truman State University and studied Belizean katydids for her thesis. Robbie grew up on a farm in Lawrence County, but now enjoys living north of Columbia with her husband and sons. I am excited to have Robbie here today to share her expertise on trees with us. And now I will hand it over to Robbie.
Okay, thank you, Haley. I really appreciate it. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the webinar. I'm looking forward to discussing Dicamba and 2,4-D as well as other herbicides with you today. And I look forward to going over your questions at the end. So feel free to put questions in as we go through this talk today. So today, we're talking about herbicides. And as Haley mentioned, I'm the Forest Entomologist for the Conservation Department. And I'm sure some of you are thinking, entomology, that's bugs. Why is she talking about herbicides? Well, that's a good question. I don't really think about 5 years ago, I had the background to do this. You know, I had a chemistry minor, but I definitely was not very aware of herbicides. I grew up on a farm. I've been around herbicides, but I didn't have much experience with them until this new issue with Dicamba and 2,4-D came up. And for me, it's been a very steep learning curve, but it's been a really important project that I've worked on since about 2018, and something that I feel very passionate about and that I'm very concerned about for our environment in the future. So this is not an anti-herbicide talk. I'm sure some of you at the end of this will think, I am never going to use an herbicide again. For me, I think that herbicides are an important tool that we need to use for ecosystem restoration at times. We just need to use them judiciously. So I really do believe in the use of herbicides at times, but I think we all need to be cautious with those. So keep that in mind as I give this presentation. So if you follow the news, there's been a lot of talk about Dicamba over the years, and we're mostly going to talk about Dicamba in the beginning, but I want to bring 2,4-D into this mix at some point too. But initially, the issue was with Dicamba, and there was even a farmer killed in 2016 because of Dicamba drift that had gotten into the soybean field, his soybean field, and he met the farmhand at the county line, and things did not go well. There's been a lot of lawsuits around Dicamba. I'm sure some of you have heard about that. And then, of course, a lot of drift complaints since 2016 and 2017 in many of the Midwestern states. There was a really interesting article that was published by NPR back in 2018 talking about the cypress trees at Reelfoot Lake and how they were being affected by Dicamba drift. And then my friends at Prairie Rivers Network have done a great job looking at this issue in Illinois over the years. And if you want a really in-depth look at what caused some of these concerns, what the history is as far as the planting and seeds and things like that, I encourage you to look up this report on the Prairie River Network website, Drifting Towards Disaster, How Dicamba Herbicides Are Harming Cultivated and Wild Landscapes. It's a really, really good report that I think all of you should read if you're interested in this. So let's talk about what's going on in Missouri specifically and what the history is here. So in 2016, we started hearing about injury to Bill Bader's peach farm down in Campbell, Missouri, which is in the Boot Heel. And Bill Bader had seen a lot of branches break and his peaches weren't doing very well. And what they discovered was that there was Dicamba that was in these peach leaves. And so it was sort of the first moment where it was kind of an aha moment, I think, for people in ag. I hadn't caught on yet because I wasn't paying that close of attention to herbicide, and peaches are not really the kind of trees that I work on. But this was really the beginning of the issues in Missouri when it came to dicamba being used in a new way. Then in 2017, there was this article published in June by University of Missouri weed scientist, and it said, the pictures caught my attention because I love to grow tomatoes. I couldn't care less about Bradford pears. Sorry to those of you that like them, but most of us natural resources don't. So the picture of that pear tree didn't do much for me, but the curled leaves on the tomatoes really got my attention. And as I read the article, it said that these new seeds were tolerant of herbicides that could be volatile. And I thought, well, what does volatile mean? That doesn't make much sense to me because to me, drift from a field is going to be something that just radiates a little bit out from that field. Think of wind possibly carrying some spray particles. Never in my mind did I think that volatility could be an issue with herbicides and that volatility could go way past the edge of the field. So that was the first indicator that there was going to be something that could be affecting natural resources. So what is dicamba and what is 2,4-D? What do they do? So these two chemicals are in the group 4 of the mode of action chart. And group 4 are plant growth regulators. So how, simplistically speaking, how they work, they increase the plant growth rate and it causes the nutrient supply to be used up by the plant and it dies. So these are auxin chemicals. They're using that auxin hormone. And so dicamba was actually introduced in 1967 in the United States, and 2,4-D was introduced in 1945, hence my cheeky title of old herbicides causing new problems, because they've actually been around for quite a long time. So traditionally, these have been sprayed in the early part of the growing season, usually in cornfields, when the weather was cool. And that meant that even though they were volatile by nature, they didn't produce much volatility from those fields sprayed during cool weather. This was also sprayed during a time when, sensitive species weren't leafed out yet. So very early part of the growing season, before the trees had started leafing out, before we would see many of our prairie forbs on the landscape. And interestingly, for a long time, and even currently, there's very widespread use of both dicamba and 2,4-D, not only in cropland, but also on rangeland, in right-of-way use, and more importantly, in our yards all across the U.S. Very widespread use. So these summer applications that are now occurring in the U.S. were traditionally avoided with dicamba and 2,4-D. And that's because people knew from a very early point in time after using these chemicals that summertime temperature inversions can lead to drift. And that's because the volatility can get stuck in those temperature inversions and then moved around across the landscape, or maybe even spray particles can get stuck in those inversions and moved. There was a study done in the 70s in Washington state where they were looking at grapes being damaged by 2,4-D drift. So this is something that's been known for a long time. Volatilization is common in summer when the temperatures get higher. And so we avoided using these chemicals during the summertime because that was a known issue with them. And there's lots of known sensitive species out, all kinds of trees, all kinds of plants. And in general, agriculture was pretty responsible with these chemicals and just didn't use them then because of the known sensitive species. So in recent decades, there's been renewed interest in dicamba and 2,4-D as, crop herbicides, even growing season crop herbicides, because of the resistance to glyphosate, to Roundup in a lot of weeds at this point. So in general, dicamba and 2,4-D work best on very small weeds. They're not something that's going to kill larger weeds that are established in a crop field. And unfortunately, we've already seen resistance to dicamba start to come about in fields in 3 to 6 generations. So this resistance is already occurring in some of these new settings with these dicamba products. So this is something that it has not been fixed. Dicamba and 2,4-D being used in this way has not been a panacea at all. And because of the new usage, there has been a huge increase since 2017 in the amount of pounds of the active ingredient dicamba and 2,4-D that are being used across the croplands of the US. And by huge, I mean more than a tenfold increase. So this has gone up drastically in a very short period of time, relatively speaking. So let's look at dicamba. What we do know is that sensitive plants, like I mentioned on a slide or two ago, are injured by as little as 1/20,000th of a standard use rate. 1/20,000th. I can't even hardly comprehend that, to be honest with you. But that picture there of those soybeans with slightly puckered leaves, that's 1/20,000th the use rate sprayed on those. When you start looking at 1/200th of the use rate sprayed on beans that are not tolerant to dicamba, you're looking at a 14% yield loss. So this kind of drift is certainly an issue not only for natural resources, but also for agriculture. That branch right there is from a peach tree, and that was sprayed with 1/20th of the standard use rate of dicamba, and that's how much damage was seen on peach. So it really does not take very much of this herbicide to cause damage to very sensitive species. So let's talk about how herbicide moves. And I find that for me, this was really hard to wrap my mind around because I thought there was only one way that herbicide could move. I didn't realize that there were multiple ways that it could happen. So for me, the most practical, obvious way is direct particle drift, right? So maybe the sprayer is going a little too fast, maybe the wind's going a little bit too fast across the field when the sprayer's there, and you end up with actual droplets moving out of the field on air onto vegetation that spray was not intended to hit. So to me, that's a pretty easy thing to understand overall. And that's a very common type of drift that we see in Missouri, but it's certainly not all the drift we see. So originally when dicamba and 2,4-D were being used on these new seeds that were tolerant to them, one of the things that we saw as far as widespread damage was concerned was tank contamination. So applicators, farmers and professional applicators were probably not rinsing out their tanks quite as many times as they should have in between different herbicides. And so since 1/20,000th of the use rate of dicamba can cause damage to beans that are not tolerant, we actually saw that applicators were causing some of the issues with soybean injury in the early part of this new cropping system. So that was certainly a problem, but I think the applicators very quickly figured that out and rectified that. When it came to temperature inversions, we saw that droplet size makes a difference. And sometimes the sprayers, you can calibrate your sprayer to have bigger droplets or smaller droplets, but some of those really small droplets can actually hang in a temperature inversion. And if you don't know what a temperature inversion is, well, I'm not sure I'm going to explain it very well, but basically, as the day wears on and we get closer to nightfall, cooler air starts to settle. And you get these temperature differences closer to the ground relative to higher up in the atmosphere. And so those inversion layers are very common in Missouri. In fact, at least a third of the summer nights create inversion layers, maybe closer to half of our summer nights end up inversions. And for me, it's best illustrated by thinking about if you have to get up real early in the morning and go somewhere super early as the sun's coming up, if you look out across the fields and you see the wooded draws, you'll see sometimes these foggy fingers of air layers that are kind of scattered about the field or about the wooded areas. And those are the inversion layers that have settled in over that area. And if droplets get trapped in those inversion layers, they can actually be moved across the landscape in those air masses, and then potentially they can settle over vegetation that's sensitive. So we know that temperature inversions can cause a problem with lots of different herbicides, not just dicamba and 2,4-D. And then there's also a new one for me, and this is erosion and wet loading. And erosion is just not meant here for soil erosion, but the erosion of particles of herbicides or maybe even insecticides like neonicotinoids that end up as dust, very fine dust in the air, and then can end up in the atmosphere in an atmospheric loading type situation. And then the rain will knock that out of the air. So we call that wet loading. When that comes back down, those pesticides come back down in precipitation. Unfortunately, MU has detected both dicamba and 2,4-D in rainwater. So we know that that's a potential route for these herbicides to make it to vegetation that they were never intended for. And then lastly, the one that I think we all need to understand a little bit better, that's volatility. It also goes by the term vapor drift. And this is the conversion from a liquid to a vapor of the herbicide after it's been applied on target. So in this situation, the applicator followed all the rules, did everything appropriately, put the herbicide in the field, and then because of the inherent chemical properties of that herbicide and probably the properties of the weather that's happening at the time, that herbicide converted from that liquid into a vapor. Enough active ingredient made it into the vapor and off it went. Now it could either go up into an inversion layer that's settling in, it could go up into the atmosphere and collect there and then come back down in another place with rain. But volatility is how these two herbicides in particular, dicamba and 2,4-D, are likely causing quite a bit of problems across our landscape. So we know that dicamba is volatile. We've always known that its volatility is common above 85 degrees Fahrenheit when there's high humidity and when it contacts leaves. And so in Missouri, if you think about when this new spray schedule is happening, it's May and June. Are we above 85 degrees in Missouri in May? Yeah, a bit, and definitely almost always in June. Humidity is always high, so we've got that working against us. And when dicamba is being sprayed this time of year, it's being sprayed over the top of growing soybeans. And so a lot of it is hitting leaves and not soil. So that makes it just a more volatile situation. Even these products that have been made for this, these new dicamba products and the volatility reducing agents that have been added to these tanks, these mixes are still not enough to completely eliminate the volatility that is just inherent to dicamba. Unfortunately, this volatility can also continue for 96 hours after application. And so it's not just that 1 day or 1 hour after application that we're worried about. It's up to 4 days later. And that's a problem because, of course, we're going to probably have higher temperatures in June within 4 days of an application. And then we don't know how far this stuff can move. It might move 5 miles away. It might only move a half mile away if it volatilizes. It could be in the atmosphere and come back down somewhere else 100 miles away. We really don't know because it is impossible to trace. Not just hard to trace, but it's impossible to trace. And I think it's really important to remember that just because your neighbor has maybe sprayed dicamba on their field doesn't necessarily mean that the dicamba that potentially damaged your woodlot is the same dicamba that was sprayed. You know, it's possible that the dicamba that actually damaged your woodlot was some volatility from a few miles away or more. So it's not like your neighbor's dicamba volatilizes purple and the one down the road is green and you see these colors on your leaves. So just remember that it's impossible to trace this stuff unless it's actually a direct particle drift event. Otherwise, it'd be very difficult. So 2,4-D is usually considered less volatile, but I had a Forest Service researcher tell me about 5 years ago that you could test almost any plant material in the entire world and come up with some level of 2,4-D on that plant because of how much 2,4-D is in the atmosphere at this point. So I think the atmospheric loading and wet deposition is a really big concern when it comes to 2,4-D. And as more and more 2,4-D tolerant beans are being planted, that is going to become a bigger and bigger issue for us. 2,4-D is actually the most common thing that we find in our damage samples from Illinois and Missouri in our injured trees. And part of that could be because I think 2,4-D is metabolized by the plant more slowly, and it's held in the meristems for a longer period of time, whereas dicamba appears to be metabolized more quickly and not held for so long. So it's easier to miss dicamba in a residue sample and easier to catch 2,4-D in a residue sample. So I want to really drive this point home. It's not just drift, it's volatilization. And not only is it affecting things on the landscape as far as plants go, but we're all breathing it too. And some of these, there are some papers out there that have linked things like dicamba to long-term health issues, particularly bile duct cancers in your liver, which is very alarming. So I have little kids. I don't want them breathing this, but I know living in the Midwest that this is a possibility. So it's not quite the Ghostbusters scary green cloud. We can't see it. It's invisible. But this volatilization is in the air that we breathe. So drift happens when the sprayer is still in the field. Okay, that's your direct particle drift. But volatility occurs after the sprayer has left. Okay, and up to 96 hours after that sprayer has left. So keep that in mind. So herbicide injury, when it comes to dicamba, even after several years of labels being changed and updated, applicator training, new cutoff dates, some of the states have different cutoff dates than the federal standard, which is June 30th. So many restrictions that it's actually very hard for applicators to use the dicamba products legally. I know in one growing season a few years ago, there in Indiana, there was only about 40 hours in the whole legal time frame where this could be applied that would check all the boxes for the label for the applicator. So the 30-page label is very difficult to follow, and there's a lot of restrictions there, yet there's still quite a bit of injury going on natural resources out there. And the odd thing is, like I said, we find so much 2,4-D in our samples, but no one seems very concerned about these 2,4-D products and the massive amount increase in the use of 2,4-D in recent years. Everybody seems to be very upset about dicamba, but I think 2,4-D is just as much of an issue still. And it doesn't seem to be on the chopping block the way the dicamba products are. But the bottom line is that most people agree that herbicide injury is drastically underreported, especially on the natural resources that we care so much about, trees and flowering plants. So I've always liked this quote, never really paid attention to trees, but in the last few years, I started looking in people's yards, and it's amazing what you see. And for me, it totally went this route. I didn't realize what herbicide injury was until I started seeing it in a lot of places and doing this residue testing. And now I've passed that information along to a lot of people, and people see it everywhere. I see it everywhere. It's ubiquitous, unfortunately. And so I think after you see some of these photos, I hope that you start recognizing it for what it is as well. So what do we know about trees specifically when it comes to dicamba and 2,4-D? Basically nothing, except for a few greenhouse trials where potted seedlings have been sprayed with these chemicals, and then the reaction in their leaves is observed and photographed, and that's about the end of it. We don't actually know what we're looking at as far as long-term data goes for trees and how long they can handle these same season, low level multi-exposure events. And so you can see that, pesticides are just one small area of what I consider as greater tree stress agents. And so there's a lot of tree stress out there right now with drought and then too much rainfall sometimes, all kinds of pests and other issues. And pesticides is a small component of that, but I'm afraid that pesticides are really going to weigh heavily on tree longevity in the future, especially in landscapes where there's a lot of agriculture. So it's been thought that 3 to 5 years of heavy exposure to these herbicides could potentially mean tree death, especially if you throw a bad drought in there. So that's something that I'm actively monitoring right now. At least we can see the dead trees, though. And I put that last line in there because trees basically leave a big skeleton behind, and I can drive around and say, oh, there's a dead one, there's a dead one. But when we start looking at milkweed and bee balm and other things that may be affected by these types of herbicides, there's no skeleton really left behind. We don't notice those plants slowly dropping out of a system over time. And that's really concerning to me and to our pollinator ecologists here at MDC too. So visible damage does vary on trees, and I have to focus on trees because I've not done hardly any work with prairie plants on this, but that is a next step for us. So hopefully we'll have more information in the future. But what we've seen with trees is that dicamba and 2,4-D injury tends to vary by species, but also sometimes even within that species. We'll find one white oak that's severely injured and one right next to it that's not. And there could be various reasons for that. Maybe even tree health plays into it. Exposure intensity, frequency, and timing also plays into how much visible damage we see. And weather patterns can also change spray schedules. So if it's too wet in the fields for a long period of time in the early part of the spring, these chemicals don't get sprayed for quite a while, and the trees have a chance to leaf out more normally. And then they're hit with it at a later growth stage. So that can really influence what kind of injury we see on trees too. Common symptoms usually arrive within 7 to 21 days after the spray event or after the exposure event has happened. You may see cupped, twisted, elongated, or strap-like leaves, and sometimes the injury is very uniform across the canopy. Other times it's really patchy. Think back to those foggy fingers I mentioned. And I will see one tree that has some foggy fingers in the top part of the canopy, but not necessarily throughout the whole canopy. Sometimes when we see a white oak that has a huge poison ivy vine growing all the way up it, we'll see poison ivy injured in certain places, but not throughout the entire vine. It's really an interesting thing. And you may only see injury on older or newer growth, depending on what the plant is and what chemical contacted it. So what does it look like? I'm sad to tell you, you've probably already seen it. You just may not have known what it was. And you may have thought, well, I bet a bug did that, because some of it kind of looks like what you might see with a sucking insect that is sucking juices out of a leaf. So here we have redbud. It's downward cupping on this. And if you look at the edges, they look a little bit lighter and almost frilled, kind of like a fancy dress or something. So this is what I commonly see on redbuds throughout the state, in town, in my own yard, and this is not caused by a leafhopper or any other little piercing, sucking insect. This is caused by dicamba or 2,4-D. This tree happened to test positive for a very small amount, 3.43 parts per billion of dicamba in July. So if we tested that tree earlier in the year, we probably would have found a lot more. I see redbud as one of the canaries in the coal mine when it comes to plant growth regulating herbicides, these group 4 herbicides, because they are very, very sensitive to them. So whenever you're out and about, if you think you suspect herbicide injury on a location, look at and see if there's any redbud, and redbud will probably tell you what's going on. So this is a red oak group species. I don't know which one. But this may be northern red oak, but this tree tested positive in July for a little bit of dicamba. And you can see that the leaves almost look folded over on each other. Some of the ones that are furthest out, they're more taco shaped than they are flat. So for me, if I see any kind of cupping at all, if it's not a flat plain leaf, then there's a possibility of there being some type of herbicide that is on that tree. Here we have sycamore, again, downward cupping on this tree, and this one tested positive for a bit more dicamba, 56.4 parts per billion. Unfortunately, this giant sycamore is the one that is right next to that huge state champion bur oak down in the bottoms outside of Columbia. And so we know that that big bur oak has been hit by dicamba over the last several years too. Could be contributing to its decline, of course. So this bald cypress right here, the photo was taken in September, but we tested some needles off of this tree in early June. And what we found was a little bit of dicamba. And so sometimes we will test needles or leaves that don't look injured in order to capture that dicamba residue. And then later we go back and we take pictures of the tree to see what the final symptom, injury symptom looked like. It can take a few months to form. So silver maple, this tree really didn't look that injured except for that little tiny leaf out there on the end, but it was one of the highest residues for dicamba that we've ever tested. So that was the early part of June, 234 parts per billion, but see how reduced it was by the beginning of September. That's because that tree had metabolized almost all of that. And to what end, I don't know. It probably caused a lot of stress, because if dicamba is causing a little weed to outgrow its nutrient supply and die, what's it doing to something big like a tree? It's probably causing it to grow more than it would have intended to, and maybe use more of its resource allocation for next year. And it potentially could cause buds to break when they're not supposed to, and cause extra stress to that tree. So that's where we're coming from on additional tree stress when it comes to these chemicals. This tree also had gloomy scale on it, which is an insect that's native, but really doesn't build up on a native tree unless there's a stressful situation going on for that tree. So this white oak right here tested positive for dicamba in June, and this injury pattern right here suggests that this tree experienced multiple exposures to herbicides over a period of time. So you see the darker green leaves have a slightly different injury pattern than the leaves that are lighter green and newer in growth. So it's possible that previous herbicide exposure forced that tree to break bud again, second time in the growing season. Sometimes I see third time buds being broken in a growing season. And then, we come back in a couple of months to see what those new expanding leaves look like after their herbicide exposure. And here's a picture of a branch from that same tree in September, where there's far less dicamba that was detected on it, but you can see that those leaves have matured now, and we've got lots going on here. We have at least 3 different injury patterns going on, which to me, that says not only was it dicamba, but there were probably other herbicides that also contacted this tree. We just weren't able to test for all of the possibilities. So this level of extreme injury likely means that this herbicide exposure happened during leaf expansion. I think that when herbicides contact mature leaves, then you don't see much curling occur after that unless it was a direct hit. But if you're getting hit with just a little bit of air volatility, you're not going to see mature leaves then grow in a new way. You're going to see most of that damage occur when those leaves are expanding in the early part of the growing season, when they're contacted by herbicide then. So this willow oak, I don't know how else to describe it besides flash fried. It's like you took a willow oak branch, that one on the right, and you just stuck it in hot oil. The whole tree looked like this. And it tested positive for a little bit of dicamba both times. The willow oak on the left it has some little curly leaf tips on it, which is not normal. So obviously there's some herbicide there. That one on the right, very messed up. And what I noticed with this particular tree, and I've noticed in lots of trees since, I walked up to it and I pulled a branch down, and that whole branch just snapped off in my hand. And the branch was about 1 inch in diameter. No oak branch should snap off in your hand. You should probably hurt yourself trying to break it off. It should be very firmly attached to that tree. It should not come off easily. So I've noticed this with a lot of yard trees that I look at that have been injured by by either dicamba and or 2,4-D. You'll very easily break those twigs in half or separate them from the tree without having to prune them off. Just keep that in mind. I don't know what's going on there. I don't know why these chemicals are potentially doing that to the wood, but there's something going on with the lignin or the cellulose that's being affected by these chemicals. So this picture shows confirmed 2,4-D injury in Illinois. And the question is, what's the long-term health of a tree that gets hit this hard every year over and over again? Because these leaves are definitely not normal. A lot of us think that what we end up with is dead trees. And it's not because the herbicide outright killed it. It's because it weakened the tree to the point where other things, insects and disease, could take over and kill the tree from there. If the only thing at risk were soybean fields, then let ag do what it wants. But when you start damaging native plants and trees, that to me is unacceptable. And I completely agree with Dr. Hartzler on this statement. This is unacceptable. This is basically chemical trespass. when we're talking about volatility and some of the stuff coming down in rainwater. This is something that the farmers can't control, and they're not truly causing in a way because of the inherent volatile nature of these chemicals, but it is unacceptable and we have to figure out a solution. So we've been working on various herbicide injury projects since 2018. This one was funded by the Forest Service, and several of us states were looking at what the symptoms were on trees and how that related back to dicamba and 2,4-D loads. We learned a lot of things during this, mostly that this kind of work is not very easy. Definitely easier said than done. And so one thing that we learned was that trees that don't necessarily look that bad can test very high for residues. And that's because they haven't fully metabolized those residues yet. And so we started targeting our collections to the early part of the growing season. So if there's ever a situation where you think you need to take a residue sample to maybe be analyzed at a later date, you need to take that sample as soon as you think about it. You know, as soon as you notice that there may be an issue, or if you think there was a spray event that was a problem, take that sample immediately and throw it in the freezer. Because when you come back later and you sample 3 weeks or 3 months after you start noticing symptoms, you'll actually end up with less herbicide residue. So we found earlier sampling equals less symptom development, but more residue. That tree right there looks awful, right? But it didn't test very high for dicamba, and no 2,4-D was detected. But the tree looks terrible. So it had to be more than 22 parts per billion that caused that. And I'm sure it was earlier in the growing season. The sample was taken at the end of August. Had we sampled this tree probably in early to mid-June, we would have found a much different number. But the trees metabolized most of this by now. And so this later sampling, it showed us more symptom development, but a whole lot less residue. So keep that in mind for any work you might do on this. Another thing we found, which was really disturbing for me, was that we were coming up with other herbicides in these samples besides the ones we were looking for. So we were actually doing a screen for all of the group 4 plant growth regulating herbicides. And I think that includes 17 right now. If you use South Dakota Ag Laboratories, they'll look for 17 of these group 4 herbicides. And we had some come back that we just weren't even aware of. One was quinclorac. This is an herbicide that's used for crabgrass control in town, but it's also used for rice herbicide in the rural areas of the boot heel. And so that was part of why we found quinclorac, was because our study site was next to a rice field. So it's an herbicide party, not a very fun party, not a party I want to go to, but it's definitely a lot of different herbicides. And I don't think we've even really scratched the surface on this. I think there's more out there, and we need to do more work to figure out what they are. So in 2019, all 10 of the samples that we tested were positive for dicamba. 8 of them also had 2,4-D, and 7 of them also had quinclorac. We did not detect any triclopyr, which is another one that's commonly used and could be volatile. This bald cypress right here, if you know what bald cypress should look like, then you know that this one doesn't look normal. Those leaves are very, very strappy and long on that tree, and it tested positive for all 3 of those herbicides at a pretty high level. So like I said, we didn't test for any other groups because this residue sampling is very expensive. So it's not out of the question to say it would cost $2,000 to $3,000 to test one sample for multiple groups of herbicides. So that's part of why we haven't been able to expand much on this, simply because of how expensive it is. So that bald cypress was taken from a little town, a park in a little town named Bernie, that is in the boot heel, and you can see what the landscape is like around Bernie. So the people that live there, they have trees in town, but outside of town, there really aren't many trees to be seen for many miles. And so that park has lots of different tree species, and we're able to watch all those different tree species and what the symptoms look like. So it's a great place to go and look. But for me, I think it'd be kind of sad to live in Bernie knowing just how much herbicide exposure, I would be exposed to as a human. So this overcup oak does not look very symptomatic at all. It tested positive for dicamba, 2,4-D, and quinclorac at the end of June. And the problem with this overcup oak is that it's located right there in the middle of a solid block of forest. That red dot indicates where that tree's at. This is a solid block of forest that is really an island of habitat in the boot heel. And this tree is about 2,500 feet through the woods from a field edge. So the idea of this being direct particle drift is just not a valid idea. This had to have come in through either rain or volatility on this specific tree. So another project that we've worked on for several years now is at our 76 conservation area. It's right along the Mississippi River in Perry County. And this is a beautiful, very wooded, very hilly area. If you're ever over there, it's worth going to see just because the trees there are absolutely phenomenal. As you can see, our study plot is located within the greater footprint of agriculture, both on the Missouri side, but definitely on the Illinois side. It's almost like the boot heel over there on the Illinois side, as far as it just being almost solid crop. So what we've done over at 76, we've marked 20 oaks. We are visiting them multiple times a year, especially in the early part of the growing season and at the end of the growing season. Sometimes we fly them with a drone to see what their canopies are doing because they're great big, tall, beautifully straight oaks. And we've collected cores to look at dendrochronology on these trees too. So what we found is it's another herbicide party at this location. We've detected 3 different herbicides there within the group 4 plant growth regulators. And the other one that is probably new to this talk is MCPP. And that's one that I didn't even know what it was until we got that positive test result, but we detected it at 18.3 parts per billion on a white oak there. So you can see that we have various trees and plants that we've looked at, and we also see injury on lots of different species out there. We think through our study at 76 that timing really matters as far as when these herbicides are contacting these leaves, because we think the early part of the growing season is when trees are being most damaged. I think that later in the growing season, prairie plants are probably going to be at higher risk to issues with dicamba and 2,4-D, simply because that's when they're most actively growing and expanding, you know, their leaves and their floral tissues. But with trees, it's the early part of the growing season. And when they get hit with low levels of these herbicides early on, then that's a problem. Part of it, I think, is phenology. So when the trees are actually leafing out in the early part of the growing season, those dates are getting earlier and earlier with climate change. And I think that part of this issue is that our trees are leafing out when farmers are traditionally in the field spraying these herbicides for preseason burn down of their winter weeds. And that's just starting to coincide with when trees are leafing out. And that's part of the issue that we're seeing in forested areas. Repeated exposure during a single season on white oak leaves you with a pretty thin white oak canopy. I think for some of you, if I hadn't said this was white oak, you might not have known what tree species we were looking at, because those leaves are so injured. They're so much different than what a normal white oak leaf should look like. We call these Medusa. This is the worst of the worst in our world. So this right here is showing you the acorn. Even fruits are either aborted or malformed on trees that are really heavily hit by herbicides. We don't quite know why or how or what's going on there yet, but that's part of our concern, is because if there's no mast, if there's no acorns out there, that's a problem for a lot of species. It's also a problem for regenerating the oaks, because if there's no seeds, there's no seedlings. And we're noticing that there's a lack of insect feeding on trees that are injured by herbicides. So we don't exactly know what's going on there, if the insects are off-put by these herbicides, if it's changing the structure of the leaf in a way that they don't want to eat them. But if we're affecting the plants and we're affecting the insects, the base of our food chain, with these herbicides, then we're going to be in a world of hurt here within the next few years, I think. Reduced leaf litter is also something we're noticing at this site, because these leaves are not nice flat things that fall to the forest floor and then kind of pile up on each other. They're these almost like pine needles. It's a very different situation than what the forest and the forest floor is used to. And we are also seeing reduced annual growth. Trees that are really hit hard by herbicides are generally going to show a much smaller annual growth ring. And on a very highly valuable white oak tree, that could be a problem for a landowner if they want to harvest those trees at some point and make money on them. So these leaves right here, this is another white oak. These do not look normal and they can't be functioning properly. These trees have not died yet, but they are certainly, struggling. You can just tell by the decline that's starting to happen in them. So we do have lots of plans for future work. We're doing a lot of long-term tree tracking in different places across the boot heel, and we hope to expand those plots to some of our more northern Missouri ag locations too. We do visit these plots annually a couple of different times, and we're collecting acorns from them too for viability studies. And we have a very ambitious project that we're trying to get off the ground now, looking at air and rain and soil monitoring to figure out which herbicides are coming in and when, and how the concentrations are causing damage. Very ambitious. This project is a very expensive one to conduct because all of this testing is very expensive. But we hope that we can do some of this work in the future and start illuminating the issue for everyone who's looking more into it. So how is it affecting the ecosystem? We don't entirely know. We are making some observations right now as far as the insect feeding, and we have concerns about roots and soil microbiota and ground flora, all kinds of things. I have a huge poster that I've put together of all the different factors that could be weighing into this. Basically, it's pretty scary. And I hope I'm just that crazy person with the sign that says the end is near, and I'm going to be proven wrong. But some of the observations we've made so far really seem to indicate that this is having an ecosystem impact, slow and cumulative. And there is a need for an outreach campaign because people see this in their yards. People use these herbicides in their yards, and it would be good if we could reduce the dicamba and 2,4-D that is being used across the U.S., at least in yard settings, because it is impacting our urban trees as much as trees in natural areas. But I don't know who has the best platform for that message, because when it comes to herbicides, that's a regulatory issue through the EPA and state departments of ag, and that's not an issue that the Missouri Department of Conservation regulates. It's something I talk about a lot, but it's not something that our agency has much legal control over. So once you start looking, unfortunately, herbicide injury is everywhere. It's not just dicamba and 2,4-D. It's not just volatility, but it's also not just direct particle drift. And it's not just near ag fields. I see a lot of tree health questions come through my desk, and about 30% of them anymore are related to herbicide, whether it be accidental by the landowner themselves or something that they couldn't control that was chemical trespass coming from, surrounding ag lands. Forbs are injured too. We don't know to what extent, but we know that it could be very much a problem with forbs in prairie settings. This rose mallow right here probably did not develop flowers correctly. And if it did, then I bet nectar and pollen was reduced or not appropriate for the pollinators. I was recently at Holly Ridge Conservation Area down in Stoddard County in the Boot Heel, and just walking through the woods where those two yellow stars are, I found goldenrod that was clearly herbicide injured, and also farkleberry. So it's not just trees, it's definitely lots of other plants that are being injured by this. And through the woods. So it's something that's not just direct drift. This herbicide cocktail was sprayed on a hackberry on a conservation area. Sometimes we have ag crop on our conservation areas, and we have permittee farmers and their applicators that farm that field for corn or soy or whatever. This was an accidental overspray event by the applicator, but it's on a conservation area. And I feel that we need to hold ourselves to a little bit higher standard when it comes to these areas that we've put across the state in an effort to protect wildlife, especially. So I don't like seeing this on a conservation area. This is also a conservation area. I don't even know what herbicide caused this. I don't even know what red oak group species of tree this is because it's so damaged. And I don't feel good about the long-term health of a tree that is repeatedly hit by this year after year. So this is at Big Cane Conservation Area, that little brown sign there. I've blown it up so you can read it. Behind this sign, the various trees are planted at different growth stages. They provide important habitat needs for wildlife and ensure a renewable timber resource. But if you can look more closely at the trees there, you can see that this field edge is repeatedly blasted by direct particle drift, but also by volatility getting further into the interior of the forest. And I don't think we're really keeping true to our message right there if this is just going to repeatedly happen, because these trees are not providing good host material for insects or refuge for birds or anything like that in the boot heel. I'm not okay with it, if you hadn't figured out by now. Another thing I'm not okay with is just how much herbicide use I see across the board on private land and not private ag land. These are yards that I see a lot of herbicide use. And I think we need to be, as humans, more careful with the herbicides that we're using. This landowner was very upset that so many of his non-native arborvitaes were dying. And when I looked at the pictures from the forester, I said, why is there so much bare ground there? Why is there bare ground around these arborvitaes and those native trees in the back too? It was because the landowner didn't want any weeds. And these herbicides that they were recommended by the local farm store, they just went home, mixed some up and started spraying. And a shallow rooted plant like an arborvitae is not going to tolerate a whole lot of that herbicide being sprayed over its root system. So this landowner inadvertently killed a lot of their own trees and probably put some of their native trees at risk too for long-term issues. This homeowner right here blamed the county road for something they had sprayed 400 yards away, when in all reality, that post oak, yes, that's post oak, was most likely injured by something that the landowner maybe rinsed out in their driveway, a tank full of some kind of herbicide. And so another accidental homeowner situation. This person definitely did not mean to injure their tree. But it's really easy to do. It's really easy to go off label or to rinse a tank out and not think that that rinse is going to end up in the root system of a tree, when in all reality it does. And it can take years for that to work its way out of a tree, if it ever does at all. And this was probably the most heartbreaking of all. This was a landowner that loved their little weekend getaway. They like to keep the gravel sprayed to keep weeds out of it, since they weren't traveling this road very often. But unfortunately, after using a product that has a long residual in it called Barrier for 5 years in a row in the gravel, they eventually killed enough of these trees' root systems that they died. And Barrier, not to throw an herbicide under a bus, but just to show you that you really need to read the label and know what you're spraying. The active ingredients in Barrier are pyrifluothin, imazapyr, which has a very long residual, fluazepop, 2,4-D, and dicamba. So that's at least 3 pretty tough herbicides and a couple of not so tough herbicides thrown together in one bottle. So just be very careful, read labels. You can go online and search for the label based off the name of the product, print it out in big type, not mouse type, like what's on the label, and then read it using a highlighter. That's what I do when I'm looking at herbicide injury with any of our department issues, because labels are really important, and we need to be following them legally, but we also learn a lot when we read labels, like how damaging this herbicide is to trees, which is clearly stated on the label. So what can you do about herbicide injury on your own property? I took the stance of, this is herbicide injury that either you might cause accidentally, so be careful with what you spray and read your labels, or if you suspect herbicide injury on your property that was not caused by you, there is a process you need to follow. So first off, make notes on the date that you noticed the injury or the spray event that you think might have been the problem. Take photos of damage noticed and take those photos over time, every couple of days, once a week after the potential spray event that you're concerned about. Start taking photos. As soon as you can, collect about a gallon's worth of leaves from different plants and wrap them in paper towels and put them in the freezer immediately. That residue will hang out on that frozen plant material for a very long period of time. So you just need to stop the plant from metabolizing it. So collect that plant material as soon as you can and get it in the freezer. You may never need to test it, but at least you have it in case you do. Visit with your neighbor or the farmer if you think that there is a specific person that caused this damage on your property, but be very careful because a lot of times people don't want to talk to you about it. It can cause some bad neighborly relations, and it could be an issue. So just be aware that it can be a pretty contentious issue at this point in agriculture. And then report it to the Missouri Department of Ag through their pesticide incident reporting page. It's just Google that. And you can report it to them, but it could be months or maybe even the following growing season before they come visit you. And so that's why keeping your residue sample in the freezer, taking pictures and making notes is just very important to provide that inspector at a later date. So with that, I'm ready for any questions that you have.
All right. Thank you so much for this presentation, Robbie. We do have a lot of questions.
Okay.
As I suspected we would. So yep. I'll get right to those. So Melanie wanted to know if you have any idea how long these herbicides remain active in the environment.
So some of the reading I've done, when it comes to 2,4-D in the soil, it probably doesn't last very long, but dicamba could have as much as a 7 to 10 month residual in soil. And so that can be a concern for things like, the weed and feed products that have dicamba and 2,4-D in them. They're little pelletized products that you throw out on your lawn to kill dandelions and other weeds throughout the growing season. But that there could be a very long residual with some of those, with the dicamba products especially. As far as being in the air, we suspect a few days related to a volatility event, and we don't really have a good handle as far as being in the rain, how long some of that stuff may be in the atmosphere and may stay in rainwater once it comes down or in surface water. But I think in general, these aren't the groundwater type herbicides that we worry about. Dicamba and 2,4-D aren't anyway. They break down eventually in surface water.
Okay, thank you. Brenda is she just wanted to make a comment that she didn't realize how much of a problem these herbicides were until now, but she does use some chemicals on her yard, not these that we've been talking about, but wanted to know, is there any way to protect your plants or trees from this? Is there anything?
Yeah, so unfortunately, when we're talking about herbicides that are being moved around in the environment, there's nothing much that we can do to protect our trees and plants in advance of that. After you notice the damage, one thing you can do to help alleviate that herbicide stress is to water your trees and your plants. Drought stress has been a big issue this year across the state too, and watering is really important. And a lot of people say, well, I can't water a tree enough. It's a tree, right? They actually have pretty shallow root systems, and they're not tapping into some magical water table well below the surface. So you can legitimately water a tree. Look at the diameter of it at about 4.5 feet off the ground. And let's say it's about 20 inches in diameter. It's going to need 10 gallons of water per inch. So that's going to be 200 gallons of water every 2 to 3 weeks. So a tree that's stressed by herbicide injury, you can get it through that injury, and you just by watering it, I think, if it's not real severe injury. One thing with dicamba, it's very quickly metabolized. It doesn't linger in the plant long term. And 2,4-D, after it's metabolized, you're not going to see it the next growing season in that tree if that tree is not hit again by dicamba and 2,4-D. So, maybe one year your tree gets hit by it, but the next year it doesn't. It's not going to carry over. Products like glyphosate or Roundup, they do carry over long-term in trees. So it's really important you don't get those in your tree. it takes about 5 years to break down in the phloem if it gets that far into the tree. So be very careful with any kind of Roundup or glyphosate use around trees.
Thank you for that. Question from Brenda. She wanted to know, will you see the tree damage primarily on the side that has had the primary exposure? So she's kind of wanting to know, is it a systemic, is it all around it, or just on different parts of the exposed leaves?
Yeah, good question. So it is not systemic, at least not dicamba and 2,4-D on a big plant like a tree. And so you will, at least in my experience, I have only seen the parts of the tree that actually contacted the herbicide show injury. So a lot of times, for example, in town, when I'm looking at yard trees, like the lower third of the canopy will all be cupped because when a lawn care company sprays dicamba and 2,4-D across the lawn, there's a little bit of volatility that comes up and it just hangs under that canopy and it causes those lower leaves issues. Whereas higher in the canopy, usually there's a little bit more breeze and the volatility is not able to hang out on those leaves quite as long. So yeah, we really only see the leaves that are directly contacted by the particle, the herbicide particle, show injury.
Great,
and it can be very patchy throughout the canopy.
Okay. All right. And then a question from Stephanie is, are you aware if companies that make these products are required to provide funding for studies that you are doing or other studies like this?
Yeah. So that gets complicated for sure. There's, Bayer and some of the other big ag companies, they certainly provide money for research projects, but they tend to want to have a whole lot more control over those projects than we would be comfortable with. And so that's not a funding route that the Department of Conservation would consider at this point. And, we want to be as objective in our research as we can possibly be. And so we have to be careful with who we take money from, for sure. But thank you for the idea. I appreciate that.
Right. Next question is from Melanie. And we might have already answered this with the fact that the tree metabolizes these herbicides, but would there be active residue in dead trees then if that is the case?
Yeah, it's unlikely that we'd probably find residue in a dead tree. However, one of my counterparts in Washington, D.C. had contacted me about a tree that had been poisoned. There's a very strict tree law in DC where if it's a certain size, you can't cut it down no matter what. And a new development wanted to come in. And so they found the holes where the tree had been drilled, and then chemical had been put into the holes at the base of the tree. And so they were able to test the wood right there, and they did find dicamba and 2,4-D in the wood. And then they also found a really high, like 1,000 part per billion. It was outrageously high in the leaves themselves. So, maybe pretty soon after death, you could find the chemical. If the tree's no longer metabolizing it, I don't know how long it would potentially stay in the wood. It could be there for a while. But most of everything that we've done thus far on trees has been looking at residue on leaves. And then when we take the cores, it's at about eye level. And we don't suspect that we're going to find any residue in those cores simply because the tree is not moving that herbicide systemically. So we don't even look for the residue down there because it's really highly unlikely to be there.
Okay, great. Question from Linda is there any way that the sale price of every herbicide could include a surcharge to pay for some portion of testing for chemical trespass and restitution to non-consenting victims? That would more accurately reflect the true cost of using it. So,
yeah, I think it's a fantastic idea. And I think there's going to have to be somebody else to propose that besides me. But I do think it's a great idea. I agree with you entirely. Big ag is a difficult beast, as we all know. And I think that they would fight and lobby very hard against something like that, particularly in Missouri. But I think it's a great idea. I just don't know how possible that would be.
Right. All right. Thank you. Another question is, you mentioned that Judy wanted to know, you've talked about, the herbicide in the leaves. Is it possible for the roots to uptake the herbicides too?
Yes, so that's an aspect that we are, looking into. I do think that particularly in urban lawn settings, where your lawn care service is potentially coming 4 to 6 times a year and spraying dicamba and 2,4-D over the top of your grass, that has got to be soaking into the soil to some extent. And tree roots, like I said, are actually very shallow. The fine feeder roots of a tree are, some of them even come into contact with the surface of the soil. So most of those are in the top 6 inches of soil. And that's the tree's tiny water absorbing and nutrient absorbing roots. And so I think that those roots are at the most risk for being contacted by these herbicides. And, in a prairie setting, we know that prairie plants have very deep roots, but we also know that there's more shallow roots associated with them too. And on our sand prairie sites that we're looking into, we know that the root systems are even more adapted to bringing in water faster on a plant that lives on a sand prairie, because that water is kind of fleeting. And so we think that plant roots that act like that, and maybe there's herbicides in the water, in the rainwater coming down, those plants may be taking in a whole lot of herbicide in a short period of time. So roots, sorry to make this long-winded, roots are a very big concern for us, definitely. And we're just starting on that work right now. We're not entirely sure how much is being absorbed through roots, but potentially some, and it could be killing those roots outright too.
All right. A question from Dana is, will the damaged acorns, etc., from these injured trees cause wildlife issues?
I don't think that there's probably much residue in the damaged acorn. I think the herbicide was probably metabolized as it caused the acorn to grow in a strange way. So I don't think that there's going to be much pass through to the next food chain level through something like that. But I also don't think that many things are going to eat these little damaged acorns. There's really no nutrition there. Most of them are hollow, and so they're not viable. And there's actually no food inside of those acorns. So yeah, I don't think that anything's really going to eat them anyway.
Okay. So yes, it will impact, it could potentially
It will
impact.
impact the amount of food out there.
Right.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Indirectly. Yeah.
Okay. Another question from Ellen is, she was referencing the study that you talked about, and she wanted to know, is that being funded by MDC, the university? Could you give us any
Yeah.
more information
So
on
the work that we've done thus far has been funded by MDC and by the U.S. Forest Service.
that? Okay. And let's see, several comments from Jen. Are you aware that the EPA and Department of Agriculture have declined to tackle this problem?
Yes, at least on the natural resources side. We know they've got their hands full with the ag side of this and the regulatory side concerning ag. There's been a ton of crop damage related to this over the last several years. So that was the big concern initially, was just all the crop damage. Now that is kind of moderated because so many of the seeds are tolerant to one or both of these herbicides, or one or the other of these herbicides. But there's still crop damage out there that our Missouri Department of Ag is dealing with. And I don't think that either agency has a whole lot of time or effort that they want to put towards natural resources. And that's why, that's important to us, obviously, at the Conservation Department.
Right. And another comment that came through the chat is that, are you aware of Roundup containing either of these herbicides?
So, when you're buying a Roundup product, look at the label to see what else is in it. But I am aware that a lot of the farmers will tank mix glyphosate or Roundup with dicamba or 2,4-D. And so that's a very common practice, that there's several things that go into one tank that are sprayed at the same time. And they've actually shown that adding glyphosate to dicamba lowers the pH of the tank mix and can increase volatility of the dicamba. And so there's certain mitigation measures that are supposed to be taken to reduce that, putting in pH buffers in the water and, the drift reducing agents, things like that. So I think Big Ag feels like they've sort of fixed that problem, but that is an issue. That's a known issue. That when you mix these two products together, you can get more volatility out of the dicamba. Glyphosate is not volatile, though. Roundup is not volatile. So Roundup, if you see Roundup damage, it's because of a direct spray event, probably. It's not coming in through this volatility.
Okay, well, that was another question. So you just answered that one as well.
Yep.
So you're not aware of that being volatile.
Okay. No, it's not volatile.
Good. Mm-mm. All right, another question coming from Dana is, at the broad landscape level, which is more impactful, home use or ag use of these herbicides?
Definitely ag use, because we're talking about, 400 million acres potentially being sprayed with these, versus our urban use, which, if you live in a neighborhood, some neighborhoods have a lot of lawn care, some neighborhoods don't. And our neighborhood lawns are much, much smaller than an ag field. So there is a lot of urban use of these chemicals for sure, and it contributes to the overall issue. But I would say landscape level, it's going to be the ag use that's the biggest concern for sure.
All right, thank you. Another question from Leslie was, she thinks that it's kind of, or she's noticed or wondered if non-native trees are not as affected by these herbicides, and why would that be? Or other, non-native plants such as bush honeysuckle, Callery pear, mulberries.
Yeah, some plants are pretty tough. I've actually seen plenty of native species not affected by these herbicides too. Okay. It really, there's a gradient, and it could be that there's not been enough sprayed on the non-native species to cause a reaction. Every species has its threshold basically. And I spend most of my time working on natives, and even then I have to narrow it down to economically important or ecologically important natives. So white oak and northern red oak, things like that. And I see that white oak is injured way more than, for example, the northern red oak. It seems to be a little bit less affected. It takes more of the herbicide to cause injury than it does for white oak. So there is a gradient in the native species and probably in the non-natives too.
Thank you. Sue wondered if a granular weed and feed would be maybe a safer alternative to a liquid application.
I think your granular weed and feed puts that that herbicide there longer. So if it's granular, then you're probably waiting on water to eventually dissolve that granule over a longer period of time. And so it's just going to be present in that lawn, for example, for a longer period of time. And when you're talking about, they're not using any kind of granular application in ag fields, that's not practical. So yeah, I don't know, but what a granular may be worse in a lawn setting than a spray. That's just kind of my, I don't think I have any facts based on that, but I do think that, your dicamba is going to stick around longer in the soil if you use a granular.
A question coming from David is the wood from infected trees a problem for firewood or lumber that you know of?
No, I don't think so. I don't think injured trees are, like I said a little bit ago, I don't think that the injured trees are actually moving that herbicide into their woody tissues, at least in the trunk or the major branches. I think that those herbicides are staying pretty local to that season's growth, both in twigs and leaves. And so I don't think that these herbicides are making it that far into a tree.
Okay, thank you. Question coming from Judy was she mentioned that a lot of trees and branches are coming down on the East Coast from some fairly average storms. It's been a wet autumn, but also it sounds like she thought possibly some of these products could be drifting and causing some of that. Is that a
Yeah,
possibility?
I don't know. I would think I know there's just a lot of tree stress out there right now, and I actually work with pretty much every state a little bit west of me and all the states east of me, all the way from Maine to Florida. And I know that our greater group of forest health people, we are seeing unprecedented amounts of drought and then too much rainfall in too short of a period of time, and just a whole lot of tree stress out there. A lot of invasive pests, a lot of native species that are becoming more problematic because of climate change, just a lot of issues with trees. And so, while I wouldn't rule out herbicide as being a potential issue in some places east of here, I would definitely say that it's probably more related to just the ongoing last decade of tree stress that we're seeing across most of the U.S. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Um, let's see. Uh, Jen had another question, and she wanted to know if the Department of Conservation could advise the public to limit the use of Group 4 volatile herbicides to only spot application or known resistant species of weeds.
Yep, we are definitely getting there. Like I said, it's tricky because we're not the regulatory agency, but we have a very good platform with the citizens of Missouri. So at some point, I hope that our agency is comfortable making a recommendation like that. At this point we haven't, but I give a lot of these webinars where I tell people, hey, you need to be cautious with um, these herbicides. We have already banned dicamba and 2,4-D with our ag crop program on conservation areas. They're not allowed to use that
Okay.
in our ag crop fields. So our permanent farmers can't use it. However, we have not taken it off the list as far as potential options for our land managers. And only recently, I work with one of our foresters here at the Columbia office. He had an area where he bullhogged a whole bunch of autumn olive, and we wanted to see if we could use a fairly low rate of dicamba this time of year to kill that olive um, during a time of year when it's really not going to affect any sensitive species if it does volatilize. But they were also very careful and applied it on a cool day. And he thought he got really good kill of that autumn olive. And so for me, it becomes this trade off of here's this chemical that we usually won't use because it has so many issues, but here's this one specific situation where it actually worked really well. And so it is a tool in the toolbox. And until we have figure out it's doing terrible things all the time, we're probably not going to take it out of our toolbox. We're going to keep it there for when we might need it. And like I said at the beginning, I'm not anti-herbicide, but I am all about being very cautious. And this particular situation, we were very cautious with it. The forester did a lot of homework on it and did it correctly. And so I think it was a useful use of dicamba. Rare, but useful use.
All right. Well, I think that wraps up the questions. I did want to mention that I've had several people say really nice things in the chat in terms of your presentation. One person even said that it was one of the best ones they've seen yet. So that's great news. And we really appreciate you taking your time to answer all of these questions for us today. And then again, just a reminder to all those who are still on the webinar that we will be sending a follow-up email tomorrow, and this webinar will be recorded and sent to you. A link will be sent to you along with the other resources that Robbie mentioned. And if you enjoyed this presentation, we hope that you'll join us for our next webinar, which will be on October 25th, and it's entitled Show Me Tarantulas with Becky Hansis O'Neill. So thank you all so much for joining us. Again, thank you so much, Robbie. Very informative, and I hope you all have a great evening.
Okay, thank you.
Take care.